So I have had the honor to teach a lot of people, but the one thing that has been common among all of them is they tell me, I've never been taught what you're teaching. And it's very sad, because when we leave here this evening, you will understand why I travel around the country and I teach this, because this information is absolutely essential to the proper understanding and application of our Constitution. And we first have to get rid of some real misconceptions, some wrong things that we have thought to be right for a very long time. Let me give you an example. Just shout out, when did women get the right to vote in America? What year?
1920.
1920. No, that's not true. It's what we're taught, but it's not true. As a matter of fact, there is nothing in the Constitution that ever prevented women from voting. Women voted in this country until 1807, when corrupt politicians on the state level started, tweaking with who a voter could be to consolidate power in themselves. So go read the 19th Amendment and you'll see what I'm telling you is the truth, because the 19th Amendment, we call the Women's Suffrage Amendment, does not establish the right of women to vote. It recognizes that they have that right, and it says you can't take it away. How many of you know who was the first man to die in the Revolutionary War? Anybody? It was a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks. Right. Crispus Attucks was a freed slave who had become a whaler for the merchant marines. Crispus Attucks heard an alarm on his ship and ran up deck to put out the fire, because that's usually what an alarm means on the ship. Only he did not find an alarm or a fire. He found that his own government had picked up arms against his own people. Crispus Attucks ran back below deck, grabbed 55 of his shipmates, came out and fought for our liberty. I'm going to read you a poem that was written about Crispus Attucks in his day by a man named John Boyle O'Reilly. Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was leader and voice that day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick car and gray. Call it riot or revolution. His hand first clenched at the crown. His feet were the first in perilous place to pull the king's flag down. His breast was the first one rent apart, that liberty's stream might flow. For our freedom now and forever, his head was first laid low. Call it riot or revolution, or mob or crowd as you may. Such deaths have been seed of nations, such lives shall be honored for aye. Have you ever heard of a man named Ned Hector? Ned Hector was also a freed slave who fought in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. When his unit was given the order to retreat, he refused. He said, "The enemy shall not have my team. I will save the horses or perish myself." The truth in our history is that there were battalions of freed slaves who fought for our liberty. Many of the states had provisions that said if you were a slave and you want to fight for liberty against the British regulars, you are now a free man. Do you know what that means, though? What that means is there are men who gave their only free breath so that we could have liberty. And in their day, they thought that we would be remembering them, be repeating their names, and teaching about them in our history courses forever. How do we honor these men today? We completely wipe them out of our history books. We deny them their due honor so that our progressive education system can perpetrate lies about our foundation of our country, about our liberty, about our founders, and keep people slaves. Who held the second Tea Party meeting after the Boston Tea Party? It wasn't Ron Paul and Rick Santelli. It was the women. Over 55 women met in the home of Elizabeth King. Their leader was a woman named Penelope Barker. They met in Edenton, North Carolina. They signed a pledge that said they would purchase no English-made goods until the laws that had enslaved their people had been repealed. Now, what we learn about the women during the foundation of our nation from our progressive school system is that they were irrelevant, that they were weak, that they were oppressed by overbearing husbands, because everybody knows the Constitution was written by a bunch of rich white guys who hated everybody but themselves and their money. And who would they ever be to give women any credibility? So I want you to keep in mind that false history when I read to you what the women in this meeting said about their tea party. They said, "We are signing our names to a document, not hiding ourselves behind costumes like the men in Boston did at their tea party. The British will know who we are." Does that sound like a bunch of weak, irrelevant women afraid of their overbearing husbands, calling out the men for being weenies hiding behind costumes?
Yeah.
See, the truth in our history is that the women were strong. They were brave. They were full of resolve to see and make sure that their children did not end up in slavery. And how do we honor them? These are the things that we have to defeat if we're going to learn the truth about our foundation, about our country. Another misconception, that the principles that are embodied in our Declaration of Independence, in our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights were invented in 1776. And that the framers of our nation sat down and wrote the entire Constitution and Bill of Rights in 1787. That's simply not true. But you see, you have to teach that in order to have an entire generation of people raised to believe that since the Constitution was written by a bunch of rich white guys who hated everybody but themselves and their money, and it was written over 200 years ago, and they couldn't possibly know what we're seeing right now, the Constitution must be outdated, antiquated, and irrelevant. Dick Durbin just said the other day, we need to ask 21st century questions about a document that was written over 200 years ago. Because they want us to believe that our framers had no idea what we would see. Surely they didn't know about emails and Twitter and Facebook, nuclear weapons and bazookas, drones. But the truth of the matter is, they knew exactly what we would see. They didn't have to know Facebook and Twitter and drones and nuclear weapons to know what the enemy of liberty looks like and the tools that enemy uses over and over and over again. You see, Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." Alexander Hamilton said, "Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred." See, our framers didn't have to be psychics. They didn't have to have a crystal ball. They didn't have to go see a psychic medium to know what we were going to see. They didn't even have to have a burning bush experience. They had the lamp of history. And they knew, as Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. How many of you have heard this saying that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it? That's not entirely true. Remember, Patrick Henry said the only way you'll know your future is by your past. Alexander Hamilton said, there are some things that are always true, no matter what day you live in. See, there is nothing new under the sun. Human nature never changes. But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And the funny thing is, before you leave here this evening, you're going to have a sneaking suspicion that the only ones that don't know their history are the ones that are supposed to be preventing the mistakes from repeating themselves. See, our framers knew their history. They didn't have to invent anything. They were not winging it. They knew where liberty came from. After all, they started off as subjects to a king. Our Constitution is of British history. Now, I get some arguments from people like that, saying, well, we're the America, we're the melting pot. What do you mean we are of British history? Well, surely we're the melting pot now, but in 1776 we were not. And even if you were a colonist from some other part of Europe, the minute you declared yourself a colonist, you were a British citizen. I ask you, if we were not British citizens in 1776, then why did we declare independence from Great Britain? Why were we so upset at the laws that the Parliament was enforcing on the colonies when we were not getting representation in Parliament? If we were not British, why would Parliament be obligated to give us representation? Because the colonists were British. And our Constitution has a British history. But you see, you don't go to bed one night a subject to a king and wake up the next morning a freeman in a republic. Something has to happen to change the hearts and minds and souls of the people, to make them understand the difference between a kingdom and a republic. You see, in a kingdom, the king holds all the power and hands out the rights to the people as he sees fit. In a republic, the people hold all the rights and delegate the power to government as they see fit. You can't get any further away on the spectrum than that. By the way, how many of you have heard lately, or in your past, or even in your education system, that we are a democracy?
Too often.
Well, we need to not simply grumble and mumble about that. We need to fight against that. Because you see, there is a big difference between a democracy and a republic. But shockingly enough, there is no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. You see, in a kingdom, remember, the king holds all the power and hands out the rights as he sees fit. In a democracy, the mob just takes the place of the king. The mob holds all the power and hands out the rights as they see fit. Jefferson said, despotism in the hands of one is no different than despotism in the hands of 174. And unless you want to live in a democratic kingdom, we should be fighting against this theft of our language and requiring our elected employees to refer to our government in its proper form. But what happened? What happened to make us no longer subjects, to make us freemen in republics? Well, you have to understand the transition that occurs over history. And when we learn that transition, you will find history repeating itself. For our Constitution, for this study purpose, our history begins in 1041. In 1041, Great Britain is a kingdom. Every other nation in Europe is a kingdom. But Great Britain is unique. Because remember, in a kingdom, the king holds all the power and hands out the rights. Great Britain is different, though. Although they're a kingdom, they have something that makes them unique. It's called common law. It's a common set of laws based on common social standards, written so that all could commonly know it, and in theory it was supposed to be applied to all classes commonly. You think it worked out that way?
No.
No. But you see, what common law did was put a restraint on a king. You see, when you live in a kingdom, and the king has all the power and hands out all the rights, what was your right yesterday may not be your right today. What was your right today may not be your right tomorrow, because you are left to the whim of the sovereign. Whatever happened the night before made him mad, and he doesn't like you anymore, so he's going to take back those rights. Or maybe he had a really good day today, and tomorrow you get a whole bunch more, but the next day, not so much. So every day, the subject of a kingdom wakes up wondering what the king is going to do to them. But in Great Britain, it's different, because the common law establishes that when you wake up every day, some things are always right and some things are always wrong. Which means there are some things the king cannot control. A limitation on the king. They had a king by the name of Edward the Confessor. Edward had granted the right to the people to meet with their barons and lords twice a year. Now, the barons and lords could be loosely equated to our representatives, because the barons and lords had direct access to the king and had law-making capability. So what happens then is the people meet with their barons and lords, and they talk about the things that they like, and they talk about the things that they don't like, and the idea is then that the barons and lords will carry that information to the king. And what do you suppose the king will do with that information? Whatever he wants, right. Whatever he wants. Are kings elected?
Nope.
Are kings appointed? Kings are on the throne by divine right. Divine right means that God himself, through birthing a king in a certain order in a certain family, creates kings. So with divine right, the only one a king ever has to answer to is God himself. And so the input of the people is irrelevant to the king, but not irrelevant to the people. Because what we're doing here is we're sparking, we're planting a seed of understanding in the people that they have a right to be involved in their government. They have a right to have something to say about how they live. Now, Edward is about to die, but he's had no sons, which means there's no direct heir. And with no sons, that means a cousin has got to be king now. But the people of Great Britain, they don't want a cousin to be king, because that means you get a foreign king come in. And when you get a foreign king come in, you never know what you're going to get. So they hatch out a plan to keep an Englishman on the throne. They're going to appoint a man named Harold to be king of Great Britain. But the year is 1066. We're not appointing kings yet. We're not electing kings. And the rightful heir is a man named William I. He's in Normandy. He finds out that they're trying to pass him over the throne by picking somebody who doesn't even have a bloodline to the throne. And he gets upset. William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror?
That's Norman invasion.
He conquers, right? So William I raises his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people, sets himself up on the throne. You know this battle probably from your history lessons as the Battle of Hastings, 1066. Now, we also know from watching medieval movies that this is how things work, right? Kingdoms were taken over, kingdoms split. This sort of thing happened all the time. That's why we had knights in shining armor and that sort of thing. But you see, this is different in this situation because Great Britain is unique. And William hates Great Britain. Now, he doesn't have to come out and say that, right? Because we'd be better off judging a person by their actions than by their words. Don't you wish we voted like that? You see, William gets to Great Britain, not so fond of this common law thing, and starts setting about changing Great Britain. He's going to fundamentally transform Great Britain. The first thing that William does is he passes a law that says, if you're going to address the king in the king's court, you can only speak to the king in French. That would be like going to Washington, D.C. and being told if you wanted to speak to the president or your representative, you could only do it in a foreign language. Well, that's not all William does, because he's got to fundamentally transform Great Britain to bring it to his liking. And if you're going to fundamentally transform a kingdom that is unique, what is the first thing you're going to attack? The thing that makes it unique, right? What makes Great Britain unique? Common law. See, William doesn't like the fact that he's being told this common law says there are some things you can't do, king. There are some things that are not open to you. So William starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. He starts using those judges to replace the common law with his foreign law. He starts taking over the head of the church, replacing the church leadership with men who are not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to the ideology of the king, so he can use the church to enforce his unconstitutional laws and collect arbitrary taxes. He starts running the private landowners off of their land through threat and force itself, literally running some of them completely out of the kingdom, and then taking their land and handing it over to his foreign friends. How else do you keep foreign law in a nation if it's not full of people who like the foreign law better than the common law of the land? This goes on for about 40 years. William has had 4 sons. William's first son, he and his first son do not get along. As a matter of fact, his first son tries to murder him. Now, if you're the son of the king, and you've unsuccessfully attempted to murder the king, you're probably not sticking around in the kingdom very long, right? He runs off to the Holy Land, fights in the crusade. Now, William's second son was killed in an accident, leaving his 2 younger sons, now heir to the throne, William II and Henry I. William II takes the throne and is recorded through history as being a wicked, vicious king. William II rules for just a short while because one day William II and his little brother Henry I are going to go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party accidentally hits William and kills him right there. Interestingly enough, catapulting Henry to the throne. Now, do you think this was an accident? Neither did the people of Great Britain. Now, when a people of a kingdom do not accept a king, do they go hunting for a new candidate? Do they engage in a recall election? No. When the people of a kingdom don't like a king, they get together and they chop off his head. So Henry, being fond of his head, realizing the people were not expecting him, or were not accepting him as king, decides that we've got to come up with a plan to appease the people. So the advisors decide that they're going to do an investigation. They call it a grand tribunal to determine whether Henry is at fault for the death of his brother. How do you suppose that's going to work out when the government is investigating itself? Like the Department of Justice investigating Eric Holder, or the Benghazi, or IRS, or NSA, or whatever, right? The results are exactly the same. Henry is not at fault for the death of his brother. Now, the people of Great Britain are not believing this investigation to be fair and balanced. So Henry and his advisors realize they're going to have to do something else to appease the people. So the first thing Henry promises is that he's going to marry an Anglo-Saxon woman. Now, the Anglo-Saxons are the majority of the population in Great Britain at this time. And they figured if they can appease the majority, they've got most of the battle won. Now, look at how this works. If you are Anglo-Saxon, and you now have an Anglo-Saxon queen, you have to believe that some of the benefits are going to come your way, right? So we're going to appease the majority of the people with the expectation of stuff. You can keep them pacified as long as they're expecting you're going to be giving them things. The second thing that Henry does is the most important thing that Henry does. Henry signs the first document in the genealogy of our Constitution. You see, that history that Patrick Henry was talking about is actually 700 years that it took to write our Constitution. There are 5 documents that had to be written over those 700 years before our Declaration of Independence could even exist, before the principles in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights would even be a concept in the minds of our framers. This first document Henry signs is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It is a promise from Henry that kings will no longer be evil and oppressive. Henry makes a list of 14 things that kings cannot do ever again, because if they do them, they will be evil and oppressive. One of the things Henry says is, if any of my baron or earl shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. So remember, Henry is a king. He's got no obligation to the people whatsoever. Henry has identified that when a government requires the heirs of an estate to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it, that is an evil and oppressive government. How is it that a king in 1100 identifies inheritance tax as evil and oppressive, and our government calls it revenue? Isn't that what inheritance tax is? Purchasing your inheritance from the IRS before you can get it? I mean, don't pay your inheritance tax, see how much you get, and then you'll get an idea of who actually owns your property. The second thing, another thing that Henry says is, if any of my barons should commit a crime, he will not bind himself to the crown, as was done in the time of my father and brother, but shall stand for the crime as the law demands, and make amends that are appropriate. Henry's saying, if the men who make the laws consider themselves above the law, you have an evil and oppressive government. We need to start that. You may be an evil and oppressive government if you have inheritance tax. You may be an evil and oppressive government if the men who make the laws are above the law. Can you think of a few that fit that category? Can I mention to you that these hearings that we're watching are completely worthless? Remember Alexander Hamilton said experience is the oracle of truth? And where the responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive. I can give you some very unequivocal, some very sacred and conclusive truths. Are you ready? I'll give you 3 of them. How's that? I watched the Fast and Furious hearings. I was a prosecutor, before I started doing all of this, involved in criminal law for nearly a decade. I was a prosecutor for 7 years. I worked on the defense side, defending constitutional liberties for a little over 2 years. I watched the Fast and Furious hearings. I can guarantee you 3 things. Number 1, you and I didn't see all the evidence that they had against Eric Holder. That's a prosecutorial fact. Ask any law enforcement officer, ask any prosecutor. All the evidence that goes to the prosecutor's office, only a small portion of it ever gets to the courtroom. Guarantee number 2, if the evidence that we did see they had against me, I would not be getting a finger wagging from Congress. I would be under a federal prison. Because in this country, when you aid and abet a murder, that makes you a principal to the murder, which makes you guilty of the murder as if you had pulled the trigger itself. And according to the evidence, Eric Holder is a murderer. But what did we do to Eric Holder? We found him in contempt. Well, that brings up guarantee number 3. How many of you have read Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution lately? Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution is the Impeachment Clause. It says Congress shall remove from office the President, the Vice President, and a third class of people we always forget called all civil officers. Congress shall remove the President, the Vice President, and all civil officers from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. Contempt is a misdemeanor. Eric Holder is a civil officer. Article 2, Section 4 says Eric Holder shall be removed from office. And when you're in the legal field and you see that word shall, it's a no-brainer. You don't get to choose or make up your mind what you do. You do exactly what that shall says you'll do. So explain to me how the Constitution requires mandates and commands that Congress remove Eric Holder from office, and we've done nothing. See, this is where guarantee number 3 comes. You will never see anything happen from any congressional hearing. Because the very first one, the very first big one that we've had demands Eric Holder's impeachment, and Congress is okay with just ignoring the Constitution. And so IRS, HHS, Benghazi, we're going on number 3 now, NSA, they're just a bunch of dog and pony shows to give your congressman sound bites to play during campaign ads for his next election to make you feel good about what he's doing up there. See, I'm going to tell you what, there are only 3 things I want from my congressman, and he knows that. I've told him to his face several times. Only 3 things. Defund, disarm, and dissolve these unconstitutional agencies. There you solve your budget crisis right there. Henry signs the 1100 Charter of Liberties not because he believes what he's writing, but because he's appeasing the people. And now the people have a promise. And 100 years later, they're going to have another king. History records this king to be one of the most evil kings Great Britain will ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. John is the king that brought income tax to Great Britain. Now that's not why he is so evil. He is so evil because if you cannot pay your taxes in John's day, which is highly likely, you're arrested, you're imprisoned, you're mutilated. Hands, feet, ears, tongues cut out. And if you're lucky, you're executed. They said he was ruthless and vicious with his tax collection. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many of you have heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. Can we take just a second and show you how deep your socialist indoctrination goes? Somebody shout out, what is Robin Hood's claim to fame?
Steal from the rich and pay to the poor.
Rob from the rich and give to the poor. No, that's another lie. See, Robin Hood was not engaged in redistribution of wealth. Isn't that what robbing from the rich and giving to the poor is? He's not engaged in redistribution of wealth because Robin Hood is not robbing from the rich. Robin Hood is taking from the king and the crown the money that has been stolen from the people through oppressive and unconstitutional taxation and returning it to the people so they can literally live. Remember, John's murdering you if you can't pay your taxes. Robin Hood's not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. Robin Hood's giving people their lives back. He's a liberty fighter, not a socialist. Something else interesting about Robin Hood, about John's day. Murdering people for not paying their taxes was not enough to bring a revolution. Because history proves that when a fact of human nature, that when you have a society that is focused only on provision, focused only on prosperity, and focused only on what they have in their hand or what they're promised to get, tyrants will always be able to trickle down just enough to make you a happy slave. But you see, tyrants always commit a fundamental error. They get power drunk. They start thinking they can do anything, and the people will just sit by and let it happen. See, the people of Great Britain have chosen a man named Stephen Langton to be their archbishop, the head of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to take over the head of the church. I'm going to pick who the head of your church is going to be. But you see, it's just been 100 years since the 1100 Charter of Liberties, and John has already forgotten that the very first promise Henry made was that the church would be wholly free from government intrusion. That should sound familiar to you. That's the first aspect of our First Amendment. Separation of church and state was not invented by Thomas Jefferson, although it was reinvented by the ACLU. It was written down by Henry I when he declared that the government will keep its nose out of the church, because that's what separation of church and state is. Separation of church and state is not the teaching that God has no place in government. It is the teaching that government has no business in your church. A revolution is brought against John, bringing the second document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Magna Carta of 1215. Now, how many of you have heard of the Magna Carta before today? How many of you have heard of the 1100 Charter of Liberties before today and you didn't hear it from me? See, even our best modern constitutional studies, if they bring you beyond 1776, they stop at the Magna Carta. I don't get that. You're missing something really big, because remember, we're trying to figure out what happens to people to take them from being subjects to being freemen in a republic. And without the 1100 Charter of Liberties, you miss that. Number one, the Magna Carta does not exist without the 1100 Charter of Liberties. See, who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I, right? The king. Who wrote the Magna Carta? The people. Now, they were the aristocracy, the barons and the lords, but the barons and the lords had no rights and privileges. They were subjects to. They were bound by the decrees of the king as every other subject. So what you have here now is the people standing up and saying, hey, wait a minute, you made a promise in 1100 that the kings would no longer be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty and tell the king how to run run the kingdom so he can keep his promise. See, without that promise, there is no Magna Carta. The Magna Carta says there'll be no taxation without representation. And then creates a committee of 25 men who will sit in the king's court with the authority and the power to look the king in the eye and say, no, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. Clauses 39 and 40 in the Magna Carta are the very seeds to our 5th, 6th, 7th Amendments. Our due process clause in the Constitution were not invented by our framers. They were inherited through the Magna Carta. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta declares the right of the people to petition the government of their grievances. Let me ask you a question. A little pop quiz. No cheating on your smartphones. No answering out loud. No telling your neighbor. But the First Amendment has 5 individual liberties identified in it. There are 5 individual liberties identified in the First Amendment alone. Don't answer out loud, but name all 5 to yourself. Name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took that poll, asked a group of people that question, found out only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. So I know there are people in this room who could only name 4. I also know by those statistics there are people in this room who could only name 3. And there might even be a few in here who can only name 2, or 1 or 2 that can only name 1. I don't care where you fall on that spectrum, because I asked you that question just so I could ask you this one. You see, if you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? The Bill of Rights does not protect your rights. The Bill of Rights was not designed to protect your rights. The Bill of Rights was designed to be an alarm. Can the Bill of Rights pick up a pen and write your congressman a letter? Can the Bill of Rights go sit in your senator's office and demand constitutional compliance? Can the Bill of Rights pick up a sword? You see, we're supposed to have this alarm that goes off, as Patrick Henry says, when the government approaches the jewel of liberty. Problem is, that alarm has been going off for decades, and because we don't know our rights anymore, we don't teach our children anymore, it is nothing more than a silent alarm. You see, we didn't invent the First Amendment, we inherited it. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to redress the government of our grievances. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta. We didn't invent any of them, we inherited them all. John signs the Magna Carta because he's got a sword at his throat. And the people are going to remove him from the throne less than a year later. But now they have a system in place where a committee of men have the authority to tell the king he can't do something. Now it's 12:15. Have we evolved to electing kings? No, we have not. Have we appointed kings? No, you see, kings are still on the throne by divine right, which means kings still think the only one they have to answer to is God. And now having this committee of men in the king's court who will tell the king, no, you can't do that. You have to understand, that's not going to go over very well. And the people of Great Britain are now going to have to fight over and over and over again for 400 years to maintain the integrity of the Magna Carta and get another advancement. The year is now 1620. The king is Charles I. Charles I is a massive spending king. History records that Charles likes to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Do you think they played golf back then? Whose money was Charles spending? The people's money. How was he collecting their money? Taxes. But the Magna Carta now says says no taxation without representation. And that representation, that committee of 25 men, is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending. Parliament stands up to Charles and says, we're not passing any more of your taxes until you stop this wasteful spending. Charles says, fine. But let me remind you of something. I'm king. What do I need Parliament for anyway? And he dissolves Parliament. Now, did he have to remove Parliament from the court? Could he simply said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'm just going to go ahead and regulate? Could he have held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament refuses to pass laws, I will? Isn't that the same as dissolving Parliament? Declaring them irrelevant and impotent? Well, Charles has got a problem because he wants to collect the people's money, he wants to keep spending it, but he knows he can't be too tyrannical too fast. So he can't pass a tax because he's gotten rid of their representation. He doesn't want to violate the Magna Carta that quickly again. But then he remembers as king, he has a power. It's called decree. And he can issue a decree which is legally binding on the people. And he issues a decree to collect the people's money. Now he's careful not to call it a tax. He calls it a forced loan. It's not a tax, it's a mandate. 7 knights stand up to Charles and say, tax, mandate, tax. We don't care what you call this. This is a violation of our Charter of Liberties, and we will not enforce this, and we will not comply. Charles arrests them, throws them in prison, denies them their due process, and they die there. But a revolution is born, bringing the 3rd document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Petition of Right of 1628. The Petition of Right of 1628 is that expression of Clause 61 in the Magna Carta, the right of the people to petition their government. It is a list of grievances against Charles on how he's violated the Magna Carta and broken the promise in the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It says, there'll be no taxation without representation regardless of what you call it. Yes, we do have a right to due process. And while we're at it, let's just add a couple more. You can't declare martial law on us unless we're being invaded by a foreign nation, and you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes. Because you see, we didn't invent the 3rd Amendment either. We inherited that as well. Charles signs the Petition of Right the same way John did with a sword at his throat. But the people are not going to remove Charles from the throne like they did John. Perhaps they thought Charles has learned his lesson. He's going to be a good guy now. How do you think that's going to work out for him? Well, Charles does change a few things. He's still spending, but he's not sort of women fancying it. He's got a real honest-to-goodness excuse now. You see, the years between 1628 and 1641 are very violent times all over Europe. The Moors, we call them Muslims today, the Moors, the Catholics, the Protestants, all fighting each other for territory and power. And Charles is having civil eruptions because guess what? He's not keeping his promises. And Charles is coming to the people and saying, I need your money. We got to collect more taxes. Because you see, we got to fund our allies in these foreign wars. If we don't fund our allies in these foreign wars, the enemies will win, and then we will be attacked next. It is a matter of national security that we collect your taxes and fund our allies. But you see, the people are watching Charles very, very closely. And they start noticing that Charles is talking out of both sides of his mouth. Charles is not funding their allies. Charles is funding their enemies. Because the enemies have promised to help Charles with his civil issues. Charles is brought up on charges of treason. he is found guilty and sentenced to death. That process brings us the fourth document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 is an amazing document. It reads, "The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom." Now listen to that. What they're saying is this. We've been watching tyrants now for 600 years, and we're noticing a pattern. We're noticing these tyrants use the same bag of tricks over and over and over again. They call it a malignant and pernicious design to overturn and undermine liberty. So Dick Durbin wants us to think we're so much smarter today, we got to rewrite the Constitution, right? So let's listen to the malignant and pernicious design as identified in 1628, and let's figure out just how smart we are today, okay? 6 things. Are you ready? The malignant pernicious design as identified through the Grand Remonstrance in 1628, corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing property rights of the people, the government taking over the church, manipulation of the monetary system through fiat money, and disarming the people while the government stayed armed. The malignant and pernicious design as identified in 1628. Are you guys familiar with Agenda 21 here?
Yes.
Would you be surprised to know that the United Nations did not invent sustainable development? Go read the Grand Remonstrance of 1641 and you'll see first was engaging in sustainable development. Several of the grievances against Charles line right up with the principles of sustainable development, but you're going to run across 2. It's one thought, they've broken down into 2 grievances, and it comes out to this. Charles is taking the private land from the landowners in the name of resource preservation, and I quote, depopulation. Not only that, they say Charles is attempting to remove them from the gold and silver standard by creating brass fiat money. And in 1641, they called that treason and chopped off his head. Do you think that's the last time they're going to have to fight? 40 years later, they have a king named James II. James II is engaging in the entire malignant and pernicious design all over again. But James is going to try to distract the people from his tyranny. He's going to issue a decree called religious liberty. Pay no attention to the tyranny. I'm going to give you liberty. This decree called religious liberty says that you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. As a matter of fact, you can have church anywhere you want, with any church leader you want, any denomination that you want, any time you want, and the Church of England cannot prosecute you. But there's a condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, who will be in attendance, and you must promise that you will never, ever say anything that might be construed as criticism of the king.
Boy, it sounds like King Street to me.
Good thing they didn't have rodeo clowns back then, huh? Sounds like a 501c3, doesn't it? James requires the churches to read this decree in their Sunday services. 7 bishops stand up to James and say, wait a minute, we have a promise over 500 years old that says the church will be wholly free from government intrusion. We're not reading anything. James arrests them, throws them in prison, charges them with a crime called seditious libel. That aspect that you can't criticize the king. Now, James has learned from Charles that if you deny them their due process, they're going to chop off your head. So seditious libel is written so you get your day in court. But James has nothing to worry about, because seditious libel is written in such a way that truth is no defense. So even if you're correct in your criticism of the king, you still have to die. 7 bishops got their day in court. 7 bishops who should have been sentenced to life in prison, which is a death sentence in 1688, were acquitted because 2 judges refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree, and a jury of their peers refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional crime, because that's how the court system's supposed to work. A revolution is brought against James, bringing the 5th document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The English Bill of Rights, another list of grievances, how he's violated the Grand Remonstrance, the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, and the 1100 Charter of Liberties. This one says, the late King James II, by the assistance of evil counselors, judges, and ministers employed by him, could have said, evil czars, Alina Kagan, and administrative agencies did endeavor, they said that James did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of the kingdom. Now that word extirpate, can I just admit to you, I didn't know what it meant. I looked it up in the dictionary. It means to completely destroy. If you completely destroy something, is there anything left?
Dust.
No, because then it would just be mostly destroyed, right? So what they're saying is James was completely destroying liberty. They got a whole list of things that he was doing. I just want to share one with you. So James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law when that was the sole duty of Parliament. You see, in 1688 we had separation of powers. We didn't invent that. They had a legislative branch in Parliament. They had an executive branch in the king and a judicial branch. And their separation of powers said the executive could not do legislative issues and the legislative could not do executive. So when in 1688 they said that the executive branch stealing legislative power was the complete destruction of liberty. I thought we were smarter. How is it in 1688 they knew executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty? And today, excuse me, you guys have no humidity here. In Florida, if I get thirsty, I just take an empty glass and go like this. I prefer to drink my air. In 1688, they knew executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty. And today our legislative branch does nothing about it. Now, is that going to be the last time they're going to have to fight? No. About 90 years later, we have a new king engaging in the malignant and pernicious design. His name is George III. George III engaging in the malignant and pernicious design. Another misconception we're taught. The Boston Tea Party was about taxes. The Boston Tea Party was not about taxes. If they were screaming anything, it was not taxed enough already. It was more likely tyrannized enough already. Because you see, it was not about taxes. This is what it was about. The British government had incurred a great colonies in the French and Indian War. Parliament had come up with this idea that since they had defended the colonies in the French and Indian War, that the colonies should have to pay back Great Britain for that defense. The colonists thought, wait a minute, we're colonists. All of the resources, all of the prosperity of the colonies goes to Great Britain for free because we are British. We are colonists. We are an extension of Great Britain. So why is it that all the resources and prosperity goes to Great Britain for free, but the colonists have to pay Great Britain so that Great Britain can defend its own stuff? Why don't we just become independent, and then Great Britain's got to buy from us, and then we can afford to pay them for its security? And by the way, these laws that you're passing on us are being done without any representation on behalf of the colonists. Now, the Parliament and the King had a totally different perspective on this, of course. They told the colonists, you do have representation. We have people in Parliament who have volunteered to represent your interests. The colonists said, wait a minute. If they're over there making the laws on us over here, and they never have to come over here and be subject to the laws that they're making over there, then they don't represent us. I'm just trying to explain to you that if the men who make the laws are exempted from the enforcement of those laws, those men do not represent you. Well, King and Parliament completely ignore the colonists' plea, and they set about to recoup this debt. They recoup this debt through consumption taxes. Taxes placed on goods and items that were necessary for the daily lives of the colonists. Linen, ink, lumber, paper, sugar. Stuff that you had to have every day. And then they got this bright idea. We're going to tax these items that the people consume, but we can maximize our revenue by mandating the colonists purchase these taxed items. So, if you did not purchase the mandated linen, lumber, tea, ink, or sugar, you were treated as a criminal. Your house could be raided without due process, your items taken without due process, and you were thrown into prison and then transported to Canada to be tried by the French. So they already had a right to a trial by jury of their peers. Why would the king be transporting them to Canada to be tried by the French? Because the king and Parliament knew that the colonists would not convict each other for an unconstitutional crime, so they had to invoke an international criminal court. And so when we get to the Tea Party in Boston, the tea that goes in the harbor is the East India Trading Company tea. Not by accident, not by random selection, but on purpose, because the East India Trading Company tea was the government-mandated tea. And so when Thomas Jefferson sat down to pen the Declaration of Independence, he was not simply penning a Declaration of Independence. He was penning another list of grievances against George III on how he had violated the English Bill of Rights, the Grand Remonstrance, the Petition of Right, the English Bill, the Magna Carta, and the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It's an expression of Clause 61 of the Magna Carta, a list of grievances against their king, which they declared their independence. So you see, if there had been no 1100 Charter of Liberties, there'd have been no Declaration of Independence, because we'd have never come from becoming subjects to a king to the understanding that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If they did not know their history, they would have never understood that the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, life; secondly, liberty; third, property; together, number 4, with the right to protect and defend them. They would have never come to the position where they could have said as a people, we will pledge life, fortune, and sacred honor, so that millions yet unborn may have liberty. So did I teach you something this evening? Yes. Do you agree with me now that what you have just learned is essential to the proper understanding and application of our Constitution?
Amen.
So let me tell you a little story. When I was in undergraduate school, I worked my way through undergraduate school for a little while as a plumber. The master plumber who was teaching me would not let me touch a toilet until he was certain that I had the proper training and expertise to not mess it up. So I want to ask you, why did I have to have more training to touch a toilet than your legislators have to touch your liberty? Why is it that we don't require them to know this information? Why is it that they're not sitting here today? Do we have any members from your school board here today?
No.
Do you have any members from your county commission here today? Your city council? Your sheriff, is he here today? State, House, Senate, anybody? You see, we are their employers. We have to make them have this training. And if they refuse, they have to be fired. Can I mention to you that doesn't matter whether they have a D or an R behind their name?
Amen.
Can I mention to you, you can get mad at me all you want, I got the facts behind me. Our conservative Republican House has handed more power to this president than he has stolen on his own.
Yes.
And it's either from malicious intent or complete ignorance. But you know what? I don't care which one it is, because the result is still the same. It's about time we got back to putting our houses in order. It's about time we start demanding the people represent us instead of the big corporate interests, instead of the lobbyists, instead of the people that are padding their pockets and making them happy. But that takes the hard choices. You see, I live in a state where we have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican governor, a Republican Commissioner of Agriculture, and a Republican Attorney General. And we are in a mess. Each one of them fighting to bring Common Core into our state. Each one of them fighting to get Obamacare money into our state. Our Republican governor took $30 million from the Chinese to fund our charter schools. Our Republican governor arrested one of our sheriffs for refusing to enforce conceal and carry permits because he said, I believe in the Second Amendment and I will not enforce an unconstitutional Second Amendment law. He is in trial today because our Republican governor and a corrupt state attorney have trumped up charges to make him an example to the rest of the United States. We have an attorney general, you know her, she's on Fox all the time, Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi has made it her position to destroy the Second Amendment for Floridians. But they don't talk about that on Fox. So listen, we're never going to fix this until you and I get properly educated. Thank you. You see, we are not a reflection of our government. Our government is the reflection of its people. And are you tired of an unconstitutional government? Then we need to stop being an unconstitutional people. Are you tired of an immoral government?
Yeah.
Then we got to stop being an immoral people. Do you know only 40% of people who consider themselves church-going Christians are registered to vote? And of those 40% that are registered to vote, only 40% of those actually vote in a general election. That means about 25% of the population who are supposed to be reflecting a Judeo-Christian morality are the only ones doing it. Those are the rest of the population who are supposed to be Christ-like are not reflecting very brightly. And they can come up with some doozies of excuses why they shouldn't too. None of them rooted in fact. None of them rooted in Scripture. We have got to get about our business here because we have run out of time. Sitting on the fence is not going to help us anymore. Sam Adams said this: if we tamely suffer a lawless attack on liberty, we encourage it and we involve others in our doom. So what Sam is saying is, if you say, well, so what, the NSA is reading our emails and listening to our phone conversations, I'm not saying anything I shouldn't. What do I care? So what if people are being secretly assassinated by drones? They're not coming after me because I'm not a terrorist. What do I care if the government is refusing to apply constitutional protections to citizens? I'm not going to get in trouble. Why not submit to a permit to carry a firearm? After all, what do I have to hide? See, Sam Adams says when you give in to all that stuff, you're not simply going on to get along. What you're doing is becoming a cheerleader for tyranny. Because when you accept tyranny because it doesn't affect you, you encourage tyrants to be even more tyrannical. Mercy Otis Warren, my favorite founding mother, said, we need to stand against tyranny today, or it will be our children who will bow tomorrow. People ask me all the time, KrisAnne, how do you do what you do? How do you keep up your schedule? Because I do have a pretty crazy schedule. When I leave here, tomorrow I fly to Minnesota. While I'm in Minnesota, I'll be traveling into Iowa. I think I'll be traveling into Michigan. I leave Minnesota, I go to Indiana. I go from Indiana to Washington State, and then I get to go home. I average 3 weeks out of every month away from my home teaching this. I don't charge a dime for anything that I do. There are no speaking fees. I don't require compensation for travel or accommodations. I don't tell you that to pat myself on the back. I tell you that because if you have any groups that you would like me to come teach, there's no excuses. Because it won't cost you anything. You just have to get on the schedule. I teach churches a religious liberty lesson, and I read Scripture. I teach middle school and high school students a practical exercise on government. I teach a 5-hour workshop. You guys have seen the 5-hour workshop on DVD. It covers the history that I just taught you in greater detail in the same way. Not my opinion, historical fact in the words of the framers. And then I walk through the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, in the same way. History, fact, words of the framers. Would you guys be interested in having something like that here? Well, then let your leaders know. We'll get it started. It's not a bait and switch. I don't charge for those either. So we'll come back and do that. Now, what I have today is I have these books. This book, not a living, breathing document, is the history that I just taught you in writing. I also have you figured out that our children are not learning this history in their schools. That's why I have these 2 books. The purple book is for middle school, high school students, teaches the history that I just taught, and has chapters on framers and founders. You heard me read from this book for Crispus Attucks, and for the women. There's chapters in on the men of color that gave us our liberty and the women. There's also chapters in there on other framers and founders that they won't hear other places. The blue book is for elementary students and younger, non-readers. It's in color. Each chapter has a poem in it that acts like a memory verse. So your child is not reading, but you're reading to your child. They can memorize the poem. They know what they've learned in the chapter. Now, these are not picture books with words. I'm not trying to accidentally teach your child with a whimsical story of an elephant. I'm teaching your child on purpose, because I think if you want to have a patriot, it's better to do it on purpose than by accident. I happen to be a patriot by accident. I'm a recovering liberal. I understand that, yes, thank you. Knowing you have a problem is the first stage of recovery. But I want you to not have to take that chance. I also have this book, Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America. When I do my workshops, we oftentimes have time for question and answer session, and it got to be that I got asked the same question every single time. KrisAnne, the information that you have just taught us is so inspirational. What do we do? How do we fix this? And so that's why I wrote this book. 10 things that we can do as everyday citizens without forming a super PAC, without getting a grant from the Koch brothers. Things that we can do every day to help restore America, our life, our fortune, our sacred honor. And then I have with me this. This is a 3 DVD set of the workshop. If you want to get a head start on the workshop before I come back, you can get the 3 DVD set. This is not my husband with a camcorder. This is a professional taping and a digital rendition. It is chaptered out so you don't have to watch the whole thing at one time. And we have these things available to you. I also have a website, KrisAnneHall.com. So if you get a book, then you know how to spell my name. If you don't, just come up to the table and write it down. I have over 180 articles that deals with constitutional issues, contemporary issues, legislation, all written in the same way that I teach, not my opinion, but fact and words of the framers. You can continue your constitutional training every single day for over 6 months by simply reading and studying one article a day. How many of you are on Facebook? All right, leave your hands up in the air. Put your hand down if you're already my friend on Facebook. So you can go to my website and like my Facebook page, because in addition to the articles that I post on my website, I post multiple posts every single day dealing with constitutional issues and our current legislative activity. I'll give you warnings of things coming up to vote and solutions to problems.
On Facebook?
On Facebook, yes ma'am, on Facebook. I'm also have a Twitter account that I'm trying to get better at tweeting. I'm learning. My Twitter handle is @KrisAnne Hall. I also send out Liberty updates, email alerts, so you don't have to go look at my blogs every day. Whenever I write a new one, I can email it to you. And you can do that you can get on my email list by texting. And all you have to text, I don't know if you're writing this down, but you can text Liberty First, yes, one word, Liberty First to 22828. So Liberty First as one word to 22828, and then follow the instructions, and then you'll be on my mailing list. In addition to all the traveling, I have a radio show that airs every Monday through Friday from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are just syndicated last week, so we're getting out to radio stations all over the country, but you can listen to me now live on the internet from 6 to 7. It will be 5 to 6 for you. Or you can go to my website and catch the podcasts if you don't want to listen at 5 a.m. I have a radio show that runs every Sunday, 3 to 4 your time, out of Minneapolis. How many of you have ever heard of a guy named Alex Jones?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Alex Jones Network gave me a radio show for an hour on Sundays. I am the hour before Alex Jones on Sundays. We were just notified that we are the second most downloaded weekend show that his network has, second only to Alex Jones. Because we educate. We don't complain and regurgitate. And so you can share all of these things. Now, people are always asking me, KrisAnne, how do you keep up this pace? Well, I believe God has called me to this message, and He gives me the strength to do it. But I have external motivation as well. You see, I travel everywhere. I'm always in your grocery stores, in your restaurants, in the hotels and gas stations. And I lock eyes with the young people. I don't know, I'm looking around. If you're under the age of 25, stand up. Go ahead, don't be shy. If you're under the age of 25, stand up. Wait a minute now, stay standing. I'm going to pick on you for a minute. We got people in the back that are they standing? They're just short. All right, there we go. So I go through your neighborhoods, your towns, all over this country, and I lock eyes with these young people. And I remember what Sam Adams said about tamely suffering these attacks on liberty. And every time I lock eyes with them, I ask myself, what am I doing today to defend their liberty? Because you see, liberty is not a gift you purchase for yourself. The liberty we enjoy has been purchased by the blood of others who came before us. But the liberty we squander today is theirs. You see, liberty is a gift you pay forward. And when I look them in the eyes and I ask, what have I done to defend their liberty today? If I come across a day where I've said, you know what, I kind of took the day off. I've just admitted that that day I was a cheerleader for tyranny. Winston Churchill said, still, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed. If you will not fight when the victory is sure and not too costly, you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. He said, but there may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope, because it's better to perish than to live as a slave. You and I are old enough that we may never see that consequence. But if we don't do what we have to do now, we will condemn these young people to buy back a gift that was supposed to be purchased by us. And they won't do it at the ballot box. They'll do it with their blood. You can sit down. I just want to ask you. I just want to ask you for a couple things. Pray for us. Support the ministry any way you can. Anyway. And don't leave here the same way you came in. I always ask people, why'd you come today? Why are you here? Is it a nice place to eat? A good social gathering to see your friends? If that's what you came for, I think you got a little bit more than you bargained for. Because I've planted a question in your mind. And now when you see the young people in your neighborhoods, you're going to ask yourselves the same question that I ask myself. And I just don't want you to leave the same way you came in. Because in this battle for liberty, we need everybody we can get. So just stand for liberty. Find your life, your fortune, your sacred honor. Find something that you can do to defend liberty. And help us spread the truth. Be our PR. Share the website. Share the posts. If there's something you're concerned about it, I guarantee I've written about it. Second Amendment, separation of church and state, the General Welfare Clause, Obamacare. There are things that I've written about I can't even remember anymore. I guarantee you'll find something. Just help us get out there. Now, I appreciate your time. I do. I know my name is not Beck, Barton, or Palin. So the fact that you would come out and listen to me, I do not take that lightly. I appreciate it very much. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank your group leaders for putting this together, because without them I would have no place to go. Yay.